The cruelest betrayals are never made by strangers. Before the first ray of sunlight touched the snow-dusted rooftops of Ash Hollow, Charlotte Hayes stood silently beside the worn wooden table where her parents had already signed away her future. The tiny farmhouse smelled of cold ashes and stale bread, but neither scent was as bitter as the silence hanging in the room. She kept her hands folded in front of her patched gray dress, her fingers trembling only once before she forced them still. Outside, the distant howl of wolves drifted through the frosted pine trees, reminding every Omega that another winter had arrived, and with it came another season when the weak were expected to sacrifice for the strong. Charlotte had spent 21 years believing that family meant protection. This morning taught her that, to some people, family could also mean a price tag. Her father refused to meet her eyes as he counted the heavy silver coins resting inside a leather pouch. His rough hands shook ever so slightly, yet he never stopped counting. Across the table, the trader dressed in a dark traveling coat smiled with practiced politeness, as though purchasing a young Omega was no different from buying another horse for his caravan. Charlotte searched her mother's face, hoping to find even a single tear, a hint of regret, or perhaps the courage to stop everything before it was too late. Instead, her mother quietly folded the blanket she had sewn years ago and placed it into Charlotte's small travel bag without saying a word. Then, almost in a whisper meant only for herself, she sighed, "At least one child is worth something." Those 7 words landed harder than the icy wind slipping through the cracked window. Charlotte lowered her eyes, not because she accepted them, but because she refused to let the last memory her family carried of her be one of broken tears. She thought of her younger brother, Ethan, asleep upstairs, unaware that the debt threatening to take their home had been exchanged for his sister's future. If leaving meant he would wake up with a roof above his head, then perhaps this pain still had meaning. The trader finally stepped forward and offered his gloved hand, not as a gesture of kindness but as an invitation to ownership. Charlotte ignored it and picked up her own worn bag. She walked toward the front door with quiet dignity, each step echoing through the tiny house where she had laughed as a little girl, celebrated every harvest moon festival, and dreamed that one day her fated mate would find her. Those dreams felt impossibly far away now. As the door opened, freezing air rushed inside, carrying the scent of pine, snow, and distant mountains. A long line of black wagons waited along the muddy road, each guarded by hired escorts and pulled by enormous draft horses. Inside several wagons sat other frightened Omegas, their expressions hidden beneath woolen cloaks. Some stared at the ground. Others silently wiped away tears before anyone could notice. Charlotte climbed aboard without complaint. An older Omega reached over and quietly wrapped an extra scarf around Charlotte's shoulders. Charlotte smiled softly in return and thanked her, then noticed the woman shivering from the cold because she had given away her only spare layer. Without hesitation, Charlotte removed her own blanket and gently draped it back over the older woman's lap. "You need it more than I do," she whispered. The trader laughed from outside the wagon. "Kindness is expensive," he called. "It will not buy freedom." Charlotte simply looked toward the endless road stretching into the pale morning mist. She did not answer because deep inside her heart, she still believed that true kindness was never wasted, even if the whole world insisted otherwise. She had no way of knowing that somewhere beyond those frozen mountains, fate had already begun walking toward her, wearing the face of the strongest alpha king alive. Charlotte lost count of the miles before the sun reached its highest point. The wagon creaked over frozen roads, crossed narrow wooden bridges, and disappeared deeper into forests where towering pines blocked much of the daylight. Every turn carried the caravan farther from the only home she had ever known, yet strangely, she did not cry. Instead, she watched the landscape through the narrow opening in the wagon, quietly. Memorizing every mountain, every river, and every flock of white birds soaring across the winter sky, as though she wanted proof that beauty still existed somewhere beyond heartbreak. Around her, the other Omega women spoke only in whispers. Some wondered which alpha household they would be sold to. Others prayed they would simply be treated with basic kindness. Charlotte listened without interrupting until the oldest woman beside her began coughing from the bitter cold. Without hesitation, Charlotte untied the small scarf from around her own neck and gently wrapped it around the woman's shoulders despite the freezing wind that immediately chilled her skin. The older woman stared at her with tired eyes. "Why would you keep giving away everything you have?" she asked softly. Charlotte offered a faint smile that somehow carried more warmth than the blanket she no longer owned. "Because someday someone may need kindness more than I need comfort." None of the women answered. Even the guards riding alongside the wagon glanced toward her before looking away again. Hours later, the caravan stopped beside a narrow stream winding through the forest. The traders allowed everyone a few minutes to drink water before continuing their journey toward the northern territories. Charlotte knelt beside the icy stream, cupping fresh water into her hands. As she stood, she noticed someone sitting several yards away beneath a towering cedar tree. Unlike the others, he wore plain gray clothing without any family crest. Heavy iron restraints circled his wrists, connected by thick chains that suggested he was considered dangerous, yet nothing about him matched that description. His dark hair partially covered his face, and despite the cold, he remained perfectly still, staring toward the flowing water as if lost in distant thoughts. One of the guards noticed Charlotte looking. "Stay away from that prisoner," he warned. "He is not your concern." Charlotte lowered her eyes respectfully and walked back toward the wagons. Yet after everyone had climbed aboard, she quietly reached into the small cloth bag hanging from her shoulder. The morning before leaving home, she had tucked away the last piece of homemade bread she owned, intending to save it until hunger became unbearable. She looked at the bread for only a moment before turning around. Ignoring the curious stares around her, she stepped off the wagon once more and crossed the frozen ground toward the silent prisoner. She stopped several feet away, carefully placed the bread on a nearby tree stump, and stepped back without saying a word. The man slowly lifted his head. For the first time, Charlotte saw his eyes. They were an extraordinary shade of silver unlike any she had ever seen, calm yet impossibly deep, carrying the quiet weight of someone who had witnessed countless winters come and go. He studied the bread, then looked back at her. "You should keep it," he said in a low, steady voice. "The road ahead is long." Charlotte smiled gently. "Then perhaps we both need strength for the journey." Before he could answer, one of the traders shouted impatiently for everyone to move. Charlotte hurried back to the wagon, believing she had simply offered a stranger a meal. She never noticed the almost invisible nod the silent prisoner gave as she climbed aboard. Hidden beneath the sleeve covering his chained wrist, an ancient silver mark glowed faintly for the first time in years before fading once more. No one in the caravan saw it. No one except the prisoner himself understood what it meant. For the first time since allowing himself to be captured, Alexander Ashford, the strongest Alpha King in the North, found himself unable to look away from the young Omega who had nothing left, yet continued giving everything she possessed. By the third morning, the forest finally gave way to rolling hills, and the caravan emerged onto an old stone road leading toward Black Ridge Crossing, the largest trading post in the Northern Territories. Tall watchtowers overlooked the valley, while merchants from distant packs guided wagons loaded with grain, wool, iron, and spices through crowded streets. Charlotte had never seen so many people gathered in one place. Alpha warriors in polished armor walked beside craftsmen, traveling healers, and noble families wrapped in thick winter cloaks. The world felt much larger than the quiet village she had left behind, yet the chain of wagons carrying frightened Omegas reminded her that not everyone had arrived there by choice. As the caravan rolled through the market square, curious eyes followed them. Some people barely glanced before continuing their conversations. Others whispered openly, judging the women behind the wooden bars as though they were livestock instead of human beings. Charlotte lowered her gaze, refusing to let bitterness settle inside her heart. She reminded herself that another person's cruelty did not have to become her own. The traders stopped near an enclosed courtyard where they planned to rest before continuing north the following morning. The escorts unloaded supplies while the captives were allowed to stretch their legs inside a fenced area. Charlotte noticed one young Omega sitting alone beside a water barrel, hugging her knees as silent tears rolled down her cheeks. She looked no older than 18. Without saying anything, Charlotte walked over and sat beside her. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Charlotte reached into the pocket of her dress and discovered a single dried apple slice she had forgotten was there. It was the last bit of food she possessed. She broke it carefully into 2 uneven pieces and handed the larger half to the frightened girl. The young woman looked surprised. "You barely have anything left," she whispered. Charlotte smiled gently. "Then we can both have a little instead of one of us having nothing." The girl accepted the fruit with trembling hands, and for the first time since joining the caravan, she managed a small smile. From across the courtyard, the silent prisoner watched the exchange without moving. His silver eyes followed Charlotte with quiet curiosity, noticing how every act of kindness seemed completely natural to her, never performed in hopes of receiving praise or reward. One of the guards noticed the prisoner watching and laughed. "You should save your sympathy," he joked. "Tomorrow every Omega here will belong to someone with enough silver to buy them." The prisoner offered no reply, but his expression grew unreadable. As evening settled over Blackridge Crossing, snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, covering rooftops in fresh white. Fires burned inside nearby inns while cheerful music floated across the market, creating a strange contrast to the uncertainty inside the fenced camp. Charlotte looked toward the stars beginning to appear above the mountains and quietly closed her eyes. She did not pray for rescue anymore. She only prayed that wherever tomorrow led, she would not lose the part of herself that still believed compassion mattered. A sudden gust of wind swept across the courtyard, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of pine, frost, and something ancient that none of the other Omegas seemed to notice. Charlotte opened her eyes instinctively. For a brief second, she felt as though someone was standing directly behind her. She turned, but saw only the silent prisoner sitting beneath the same cedar tree, his chains resting motionless against the frozen ground. Their eyes met once again. Neither smiled. Neither spoke. Yet something passed silently between them, a feeling impossible to explain, as though fate itself had paused to remember 2 souls it had intended to reunite long before either of them had been born. High above the crowded trading post, hidden among the dark clouds, a lone white wolf stood upon a distant ridge overlooking the valley. It lifted its head toward the night sky before disappearing into the falling snow, unseen by everyone except one man whose hidden silver mark warmed beneath his sleeve once again, confirming that destiny was moving far faster than anyone in the caravan could possibly imagine. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel. The market square that had seemed lively the evening before had transformed into something far more unsettling. Merchants arranged polished wooden platforms, scribes prepared thick ledgers, and wealthy buyers arrived one after another in elegant carriages bearing the crests of powerful packs. Charlotte stood quietly among the other Omegas, her hands folded before her, refusing to let fear show on her face even as uncertainty settled heavily inside her heart. Around her, whispered conversations drifted through the cold air. Some women prayed to the moon goddess. Others silently accepted whatever future awaited them beyond the gates. Charlotte simply breathed slowly, reminding herself that dignity could not be bought or sold. Across the courtyard, the silent prisoner remained seated beneath the towering cedar, his wrists still bound by iron restraints. Several guards mocked him as they passed, amused that a man carrying himself with such calm could still be treated as a captive. He neither answered nor reacted. His silver eyes followed only one person. Charlotte noticed an elderly stable worker struggling to lift a heavy bucket of water across the icy ground. Before anyone else moved, she stepped forward and took the bucket from his shaking hands. "You should not carry this alone," she said gently. The old man thanked her with surprised eyes. One of the traders scoffed loudly. "Save your strength," he sneered. "By sunset, you will belong to someone who will decide where your kindness is spent." A few buyers chuckled, while others barely looked in her direction. Charlotte quietly returned to her place without responding. She had learned long ago that silence often carried more strength than anger. As the morning continued, buyers examined groups of omegas with detached expressions, discussing family bloodlines, household skills, and future breeding potential as though speaking about livestock rather than human lives. Charlotte lowered her eyes, unwilling to become part of those conversations. Nearby, the youngest omega from the caravan began trembling uncontrollably. Charlotte gently reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Stay close," she whispered. "No matter what happens, you are not alone right now." The frightened girl nodded through tears. Several people noticed the exchange, including the silent prisoner, whose expression softened almost imperceptibly. Moments later, a loud horn echoed across Black Ridge Crossing. Every conversation stopped. Riders wearing dark cloaks marked with the silver crest of the Northern Crown entered the square, their horses moving with perfect discipline. The traders immediately bowed their heads, believing. A routine inspection had begun. The captain of the royal escort dismounted and quietly surveyed the crowded courtyard before speaking only 4 words. "Continue exactly as planned." Relief spread across the faces of the traders, unaware that dozens of additional royal guards had already taken positions throughout the surrounding streets. Hidden behind warehouses, atop rooftops, and beyond the market gates, disciplined soldiers waited without drawing attention to themselves. Charlotte noticed none of it. She was focused only on comforting the frightened girl beside her. Beneath the cedar tree, however, the silent prisoner's eyes briefly met those of the royal captain. The exchange lasted less than a heartbeat, unnoticed by everyone else. No words were spoken. None were necessary. The captain gave the faintest nod before turning away. The prisoner slowly rose to his feet for the first time since the journey had begun. Iron chains rested against his wrists, but he carried them as though they weighed nothing at all. Charlotte looked toward him with quiet curiosity, wondering why the entire atmosphere seemed to shift the moment he stood. Even the winter wind appeared to fall silent. Somewhere beyond the crowded square, a deep wolf howl rolled across the mountains, causing every horse in the market to lift its head at once. Most people dismissed it as another wild pack moving through the forest. The silent prisoner did not. A calm smile, almost impossible to notice, touched the corner of his lips as he looked toward the distant ridge. Tomorrow's auction was supposed to decide Charlotte's future. Instead, destiny had already arrived, and before another sunrise, the entire kingdom would learn that the man wearing chains had never truly been a prisoner at all. The first rays of dawn spread across Black Ridge Crossing, bathing the market square in pale golden light that did little to warm the frozen air. Merchants shouted instructions as workers hurried to arrange polished wooden platforms and rows of benches for the day's proceedings. Wealthy alphas arrived in elegant carriages decorated with silver crests and embroidered banners, each surrounded by loyal guards whose polished armor reflected the morning sun. Charlotte stood quietly among the other omegas, her simple gray dress making her almost invisible beside women wearing finer clothing. Yet she carried herself with a quiet grace that no expensive fabric could imitate. She folded her hands calmly, whispering gentle words to the frightened young omega beside her until the girl's breathing finally slowed. Fear still lingered in every corner of the courtyard, but Charlotte refused to let it become stronger than compassion. Across the yard, the silent prisoner remained standing beneath the ancient cedar tree. Iron restraints still circled his wrists, yet there was something strangely unbreakable about the way he held himself. Every movement was measured, every glance deliberate, as though the chains belonged to someone else entirely. His silver eyes drifted toward Charlotte again. He watched as she noticed an elderly woman stumble while carrying a basket filled with blankets. Before anyone else reacted, Charlotte hurried forward and caught the basket before it struck the frozen ground. The woman smiled gratefully, apologizing for her weakness, but Charlotte only shook her head. "Everyone needs a helping hand sometimes," she replied softly. Several nearby traders exchanged amused looks. One laughed loudly enough for everyone around him to hear. "She still acts like kindness has value," he mocked. "By this afternoon she will learn that silver decides everything." A few buyers joined the laughter, while others barely acknowledged her existence. Charlotte simply thanked the elderly woman and returned to her place without answering a single insult. Her silence carried more dignity than any argument ever could. The prisoner observed every moment with growing curiosity. During his years as king, countless nobles had performed generous acts whenever they expected recognition. Charlotte was different. She helped people when nobody important seemed to be watching. She gave away food when she was hungry, warmth when she was cold, and comfort when her own future remained uncertain. She never looked around afterward to see who had noticed. She simply continued forward with the same quiet heart. That simple truth unsettled him more than any battlefield ever had. Suddenly a royal messenger crossed the square carrying sealed documents for the market officials. As he hurried past, a strong gust of winter wind scattered several parchment pages across the icy ground. Clerks rushed after them in frustration, but before they reached the papers, Charlotte was already collecting each page carefully, making certain none became damaged by melting snow. The messenger accepted them with visible relief. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "These records are important." Charlotte smiled gently. "Then I am glad they found their way back to you." The messenger bowed his head before leaving, unaware that the silent prisoner had witnessed the entire exchange. Around them, preparations continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Buyers reviewed lists of names. Traders discussed prices in quiet voices. Guards checked gates and fences with practiced precision. Yet hidden among the bustling crowd, royal soldiers continued slipping unnoticed into carefully planned positions throughout the marketplace. They blended among merchants, travelers, and craftsmen so naturally that no one suspected the square had already been surrounded. Charlotte remained unaware of every secret unfolding around her. She only noticed that the strange prisoner seemed unusually calm while everyone else grew increasingly anxious. Their eyes met once again across the crowded courtyard. This time he gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Charlotte hesitated before offering a gentle smile in return. It lasted only a heartbeat, but something ancient stirred deep within both of them, like two distant stars quietly recognizing one another after years apart. Above the marketplace, hidden beyond the drifting winter clouds, a lone white wolf appeared briefly upon the highest ridge before vanishing into the morning mist, and somewhere beneath the prisoner's sleeve, the ancient silver mark glowed brighter than ever, silently announcing that the moment destiny had waited years to reveal was now only a few steps away. Charlotte could not explain why the stranger's silent nod stayed with her long after they looked away from each other. The marketplace around her grew louder with every passing minute as more buyers arrived, their polished boots crunching across the thin layer of snow that covered the stone square. Clerks called out names from thick ledgers while traders compared prices with practiced confidence. To everyone else, it was simply another profitable morning. To Charlotte, it felt like watching hundreds of lives balanced on invisible scales. She stood quietly beside the younger Omega she had comforted throughout the journey, gently adjusting the girl's scarf after another icy breeze swept through the courtyard. "Keep your chin up," Charlotte whispered with a reassuring smile. "No matter where life leads us, no one can take away the person we choose to become." The frightened girl managed a small nod before wiping away her tears. Nearby, one of the traders rolled his eyes. "You still speak as though hope feeds people," he muttered with a laugh. Charlotte answered with nothing more than peaceful silence. Across the courtyard, the prisoner continued watching every small act of compassion she offered without ever asking for anything in return. He had spent years judging warriors by courage and nobles by loyalty, yet this young woman possessed a different kind of strength altogether. She had been abandoned by her own family, stripped of every certainty she once believed in, and still she chose kindness over resentment. That choice fascinated him far more than any display of power ever could. At that moment, the royal captain quietly walked through the marketplace, appearing to inspect the trading permits. As he passed the prisoner's position, he paused just long enough for their eyes to meet. "Everything is ready," he said in a voice so soft that no one nearby noticed the words. The prisoner gave the slightest nod before lowering his gaze once more, allowing the disguise to remain intact. The captain continued walking as though nothing unusual had happened. Hidden throughout Blackridge Crossing, more royal guards completed their positions. Some blended among merchants selling grain and wool. Others stood disguised as travelers warming themselves beside small cooking fires. Every entrance to the marketplace had already been secured without raising suspicion. Charlotte remained completely unaware. Her attention was drawn instead to a small gray bird lying beside one of the wooden fences. Its wing appeared injured after striking a wagon wheel. While everyone hurried past without noticing, Charlotte carefully knelt beside the tiny creature. She removed a clean strip of cloth from the edge of her sleeve and gently wrapped the bird's wing before placing it safely beneath the shelter of a nearby crate where it could rest away from the cold wind. The younger Omega watched with surprise. "Even now?" she asked quietly. Charlotte smiled. "Pain always matters, no matter how small." From beneath the cedar tree, the prisoner's expression softened once again. He had seen rulers ignore suffering that stood directly before them, yet this woman stopped for a bird no larger than her hand while facing an uncertain future herself. Something deep inside him stirred with a quiet certainty that grew stronger each passing hour. Beneath the fabric covering his wrist, the ancient silver mark spread a gentle warmth through his skin, brighter than it had glowed in many years. He slowly closed his fingers over it, understanding what the mark was trying to tell him long before he was willing to admit it aloud. Suddenly the great bronze bell hanging above the center of Blackridge Crossing rang 3 clear notes that echoed across the valley. Every conversation stopped. Buyers turned toward the main platform. Traders straightened their coats. Clerks lifted their ledgers. The day's proceedings were about to begin. Charlotte drew a slow breath and quietly squeezed the younger Omega's hand one last time before stepping forward with the others. She believed she was walking toward the moment that would decide her fate. She did not know that before another hour had passed, the man wearing chains would take his first step without them, and the entire marketplace would witness a truth powerful enough to change not only her life, but the future of the Northern Kingdom itself. The great bronze bell fell silent, leaving an uneasy stillness over Blackridge Crossing. Every buyer, trader, and guard turned toward the raised wooden platform where the market master slowly unrolled a long parchment bearing the names of every Omega scheduled to be presented that morning. One by one, the women stepped forward as their names were called, each greeted with polite smiles that never reached the eyes of the wealthy alphas studying them. Charlotte remained near the back of the line, quietly holding the hand of the young Omega until her name was announced first. "You will be all right," Charlotte whispered. "Take one breath at a time." The younger woman nodded gratefully before walking onto the platform with trembling steps. Charlotte watched her disappear into the crowd, silently hoping kindness would somehow find her before cruelty did. Across the square, the silent prisoner stood exactly where he had remained since sunrise. His chains still rested around his wrists, but his posture carried the calm certainty of someone waiting for a precise moment rather than fearing an uncertain future. His silver eyes never wandered far from Charlotte. Every small choice she made seemed to confirm something he had sensed from the very beginning of the journey. Nearby, one of the traders approached Charlotte with an impatient wave of his hand. "Your turn is coming," he said sharply. "Stand where everyone can see you." Charlotte obeyed without protest, walking toward the edge of the platform with quiet dignity. As she climbed the wooden steps, a sudden winter breeze swept across the square, catching the loose strands of her light brown hair and carrying them gently across her face. Several buyers glanced at the simple young woman dressed in faded gray and quickly lost interest, whispering among themselves that she looked too ordinary, too quiet, too insignificant to deserve much attention. Charlotte heard every word, yet she neither defended herself nor lowered her head. She simply stood with peaceful composure, refusing to allow strangers to define her worth. The silence surrounding the platform was broken by the frightened cry of a small child somewhere within the crowd. A merchant's young son had become separated from his parents and stood frozen beside a frightened horse whose nervous movements caused nearby people to step away. Without thinking of herself, Charlotte immediately stepped down from the platform and slowly approached the child with calm, reassuring movements. She gently reached for his hand and spoke softly until the frightened horse settled once more. Moments later, the boy's grateful parents hurried forward and embraced him tightly. "Thank you," his mother said through tears. Charlotte smiled warmly. He was never alone. Many people witnessed the moment. Some looked surprised. Others quickly returned their attention to the auction as though nothing important had happened. The silent prisoner, however, watched without blinking. Beneath his sleeve, the ancient silver mark pulsed with unmistakable warmth. The choice before him was no longer whether destiny had spoken. The only question remaining was how much longer he would allow this cruel performance to continue. At the edge of the marketplace, the royal captain quietly removed one leather glove and adjusted the silver ring bearing the crest of the northern crown. It was the signal. Hidden guards subtly straightened where they stood among merchants, travelers, and craftsmen. Gates were secured without noise. Watchtowers received silent acknowledgments. No ordinary visitor noticed the invisible web closing around the marketplace. Charlotte certainly did not. She returned calmly to the platform after ensuring the child was safe, believing she had merely done what anyone should have done. The market master lifted his voice once again. "Next," he announced. "Charlotte Hayes." Hundreds of eyes turned toward her as she stepped into the center of the platform beneath the cold winter sky. At that exact moment, a sharp metallic sound echoed across the square. Every head turned toward the cedar tree. The first iron chain had fallen to the ground. The sound of iron striking frozen stone echoed across Blackridge Crossing with such clarity that every voice in the marketplace vanished at once. Charlotte instinctively turned toward the ancient cedar tree, her heart pounding for reasons she could not explain. The man who had spent the entire journey sitting quietly beneath its branches slowly lifted his hands. Heavy iron restraints slipped from his wrists and landed at his feet as though they had never truly possessed the strength to hold him. A stunned silence swept through the square. Several traders stepped backward in confusion while others shouted for the guards to seize the escaped prisoner. None of the guards moved. Instead, the royal captain calmly stepped forward, removed his helmet, and bowed deeply. One by one, every soldier hidden throughout the marketplace emerged from the crowd. Merchants who had been arranging grain removed concealed royal insignias from beneath their cloaks. Travelers standing near the gates straightened into disciplined ranks. Even the watchmen on the surrounding towers lowered the banners of the marketplace and raised the silver crest of the northern crown. The entire square transformed in a matter of moments. Charlotte looked around in complete disbelief. The frightened Omegas stared in silence. The wealthy buyers who had arrived with confident smiles now exchanged uncertain glances as they struggled to understand what was happening. The market master's hands trembled so violently that the parchment listing the day's names slipped from his fingers and fluttered onto the wooden platform below. The silent prisoner took one measured step forward. His plain gray cloak settled across his shoulders with effortless dignity, revealing nothing extravagant, yet somehow making him appear taller than anyone else in the square. His calm silver eyes swept across the marketplace before resting gently on Charlotte. He did not look at her as though she were merchandise waiting to be judged. He looked at her as though she were the only person in the crowd who truly mattered. The royal captain lowered his head once more and spoke with absolute respect. "Your Majesty, every entrance has been secured exactly as ordered." Gasps spread through the crowd. Several traders immediately dropped to one knee. Others remained frozen in shock, unable to believe the words they had just heard. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. The quiet traveler who had accepted half a loaf of bread without revealing his name, the prisoner she had believed to be another victim, the man she had offered kindness expecting nothing in return, stood before her as Alexander Ashford, the Alpha King of the Northern Kingdom. Yet he did not immediately address the traders or the buyers. Instead, he walked slowly toward the wooden platform where Charlotte still stood. Every step echoed across the silent square. She lowered her eyes respectfully, unsure whether she should kneel or remain standing. Before she could decide, Alexander stopped a few feet away. His voice remained calm, steady, and impossible to ignore. Charlotte Hayes. Hearing her name spoken so gently by the king himself startled her more than the revelation of his identity. She slowly lifted her gaze until their eyes met once again. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, hundreds of people waited in complete silence. Alexander's silver eyes held the same quiet warmth she had seen beside the forest stream, but now they carried unmistakable authority as well. He looked briefly toward the traders before returning his attention to Charlotte. "You shared your food when you were hungry," he said. "You gave away your warmth when winter surrounded you. You comforted strangers while your own future remained uncertain. You offered kindness to every soul you met without ever asking who they were." Charlotte felt her cheeks warm with quiet embarrassment. "Anyone should have done the same," she answered softly. Alexander's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "No," he replied. "Not everyone would have." Before anyone could speak again, a brilliant silver light spread beneath the sleeve covering his wrist. The ancient mark shone brighter than ever before, and as the light reflected across the snow-covered square, every elder present recognized the forgotten symbol immediately. Whispered voices rose through the crowd with growing astonishment. The mark of destiny had awakened, and for the first time in generations, it was pointing toward someone standing only a few feet away from the Alpha King. No one in Blackridge Crossing dared to speak as the ancient silver light shimmered across the frozen marketplace. Elders who had spent their entire lives studying the oldest legends slowly lowered themselves to one knee, their expressions filled not with fear but with reverence. They recognized what the younger generation had only heard about in forgotten stories. The mark of destiny had never chosen according to wealth, status, or bloodline. It awakened only when true strength found a heart worthy of standing beside it. Charlotte stood motionless on the wooden platform, unable to understand why every eye had suddenly turned toward her. She looked down at her worn gray dress and weathered boots, wondering whether some terrible mistake had been made. She had never dreamed of becoming important. She had only wanted to survive without losing the kindness her parents had failed to value. Alexander Ashford stepped forward until only a few feet separated them. His voice remained calm enough for the entire marketplace to hear. "Charlotte Hayes, during every mile of this journey, you believed I was powerless. You offered me food when you barely had enough for yourself. You treated strangers with dignity when others treated them as burdens. You chose compassion when bitterness would have been easier. You never asked my name because your kindness was never offered in exchange for reward." Charlotte slowly raised her eyes to meet his. "I only did what I believed was right," she answered quietly. Alexander smiled with unmistakable warmth. "That is exactly why destiny chose you." At those words, the silver mark upon his wrist glowed once more before gradually settling into a peaceful radiance. The winter wind carried a single white feather across the square, drifting gently until it landed between them. An elderly keeper of the royal tradition stepped forward, tears shining in his eyes. "The ancient bond has spoken," he declared. The future Luna was revealed not through power, but through the quiet strength of her heart. A hushed silence followed before Alexander extended his hand toward Charlotte, not as a command from a king, but as a respectful invitation. She hesitated only for a moment before placing her hand in his. The instant their hands met, the anxious heaviness that had filled the marketplace seemed to disappear, replaced by an unexpected feeling of peace. Around them, even those who had laughed at Charlotte lowered their eyes in quiet shame. Alexander turned toward the gathered traders and buyers. His voice remained measured, carrying neither anger nor cruelty. "From this day forward, no Omega within the Northern Kingdom will ever again be bought or sold as property. Every citizen, regardless of birth, deserves dignity beneath the moon goddess." His words echoed across the silent square, followed by respectful bows from every royal guard. The market ledgers were quietly closed. The wooden platform that had been built for the auction became nothing more than an empty stage beneath the winter sky. The frightened Omegas looked at one another in disbelief before tears of relief slowly replaced their fear. Charlotte glanced toward the young Omega she had comforted, the elderly stable worker, and even the tiny gray bird now resting safely above the fence, and a gentle smile appeared across her face. For the first time in many years, hope no longer felt fragile. Weeks later, the kingdom spoke less about the day the Alpha King revealed himself than about the quiet young woman whose kindness had changed the heart of a ruler and the future of an entire nation. Charlotte never forgot where she had come from, and she welcomed every person she met with the same gentle compassion she had carried long before destiny found her. Together, she and Alexander built a kingdom where strength protected instead of oppressed, where titles mattered less than character, and where children grew up learning that the greatest power any heart could possess was the courage to remain kind when kindness seemed to offer nothing in return. And whenever the first snow of winter covered the forests of the north, people smiled as they remembered the morning when a simple act of compassion proved stronger than chains, stronger than fear, and powerful enough to change destiny forever.